here.
Will we go into the classroom?
Yes, we'll be going into the classroom and showing some examples of places, experiments like this Girls Inc. thing that we were talking about earlier, where new approaches to facilitating reading, things called orchestrating reading, for example, really show what's possible when instead of having this map and this procedural approach to teaching children, we're actually making contact with that fluctuating attention that's going on in them. Like I was saying, what happens to them as they start to bog down in trying to resolve the letter sound correspondence problem. By learning to track with children down at the level where their processing flow is really happening and cue them and help them at that level.
Will we explore the human brain and see how it processes this information?
Yes. Yeah, both with MRI scans and through interviews with leading scientists of the brain research and cognitive processing level, we'll see how the eyes recognize letters. We'll see how the letters become sounds, how they go through this buffering loop while we figure out which of the letter sounds they could be, how that involves the motor circuits of the brain. We'll see this from one end to the other, and how timing precarious it is, and the relationship between these brain processes and the ambiguity in the code we were talking about and that we've been telling the historical story of when they intersect.
And what will this program teach us overall?
Number one, the importance of reading in a new way, that it's not just an academic, economic thing, it's a fundamental psychological well-being thing, that we're creating a situation again where these children are spending a significant part of their lives inside this environment called learning to read, and it's at that same time, because they're only 4 or 5 years old when they're doing that, they're emotionally immature and they are in the process of learning to learn. They're developing their learning to learn interior, so to speak. At the same time, they're learning to read. So when they start to have problems learning to read, it's shaping and influencing their psychological structure, their learning to learn methodologies that are evolving in them. So there's much more to reading than we generally understand in terms of its significance. I mean, the correspondence between reading difficulty and all kinds of social difficulties, jail time, so forth.
So this we'll also review how pre-literate adults and how immigrants or non-English speaking people learn to process English and some of the difficulties that they have.
Right. The differences in, for example, in China, where they have a writing system where there's always a one-to-one correspondence. There's never been a requirement for a complex assembly before they speak it. They can read it and speak it.
And as part of this program, we will see how English is taught, how English is processed, how the brain digests and applies the code definitions in various cultures around the world. Is that correct?
We'll see the importance of. We will take English to ground in terms of its lingua franca-ness. I mean, the sense that it is becoming the language that's connecting the entire planet. Not because of its ecology or efficiency as a code. We're also going to bring in some world-class code scientists, people who work with codes every day, and we'll actually take a look at this code as if it was a piece of code that we use in any other context, like the code of a piece of software or a DNA code. We'll actually look at the code as a code. And in that sense, we'll find that English is probably the least, it is the worst, it's actually the worst language that we can imagine propagated around the world. However, it is the one that is being carried forth by all the forces that are currently dominant in the world.
Yeah. So, you have a very personal connection to Children of the Code. Why don't you tell me about that?
It's my last 2 children. I have a 18-year-old son who had a real reading problem when he was 5, and I have a 9-year-old daughter who's just getting through a major reading problem. My work for the past 20 years has been learning to learn from the inside out, how it is that children learn from within themselves, not according to our rules or our understandings or models or whatever, but how it is that they extend their presence in their learning, whether it's how they learn to hold something, how they learn to walk, how they learn to talk, and so forth. So from my primary concern of how it is children learn from the inside, and with the love and interest of my own children, watching them learn, as they struggled with this learning to read.
What kind of learning disability?
Well, my son, at the time when he was reading, as he went into kindergarten, he was considered by the kindergarten teacher to have a vocabulary of a 20-year-old. He was off-scale brilliant, and despite that, reading didn't make any sense to him. He'd kind of grown up with Nintendo. He kind of grew up with a sense that if he could experimentally learn his way into anything. And so when he hit the alphabet and started to learn to read, he came to me and said, "Dad, what is this mess? I can't make any sense of it." And so for the very first time in my life, despite having been focused for the longest time on how people learn, I was taken into reading from the point of view of a bright child who was struggling to learn their way into it. And so,
did he go through all the stages of doubt, shame, struggle?
He didn't. He was so confident in himself and so bright that he didn't have the psychological shadow problem with the reading. He had the ambiguity overwhelm. He's where I learned that it was the code's ambiguity that was causing his voice to stutter and his mind to stutter as he was taking off into reading. So he taught the first part, but it was my daughter who... She had what's called an auditory memory processing deficit, a difficulty that meant that she'd decode a word in the beginning of a sentence. Later in that same sentence, she'd encounter the word again, and she would have to re-decode it. She couldn't remember, she just did.
Auditory
memory processing deficit.
Is this common?
No, but it's not all that uncommon either.
Okay.
I mean, it's one of the fringes of what goes on. And so she put a spotlight on decoding. And she had such a difficulty with it that she started to feel really bad about herself. She started to think of herself, "I'm pretty stupid," and it really upset me. Mm-hmm. It really upset me because I was conscious of how important it was for her not to feel that way, and yet it was a real struggle, even with my consciousness, to keep her from it.
Right interventions, right reactions, right responses. But the learning disability was still there, and the shame was still felt.
Right.
So children of the code will definitely explore this part of the child's struggle to learn.
Right, and the role that reading has on conditioning, forming the kind of learning to learn reflexes, which are at the core of how well these children do.
I think reflex is a very good word.
Yeah, there's a development of unconscious learning to learn reflexes, which are forming in the field of learning to read. And if we don't understand that, we are allowing our children's core capacity to learn to get mangled by the way that we're teaching reading.